Welcome to Press Watch 2012. I'm Wendy Brunner. Press Watch is a production of the Mass Communications Department at Oklahoma City University, made possible by the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. Here at Press Watch, we're looking at national news media coverage of the presidential campaign. Not so much the politics themselves, really, how the politics are being covered. We'll examine some of the most recent stories in the news that are related to the campaign in light of ethical guidelines that were set forth for journalists by journalists. On the agenda in this edition of Press Watch, we're talking about news and during the Republican National Convention. First up, social media. It's not new, but it is news. It's everywhere. What are the implications for journalists as we use Twitter in our storytelling? Then, polling data. See those tiny words at the bottom of your screen there? Maybe you can't see them. They can be tough to see. Margin of error, sampling error, the data and how it's being labeled for you. And then later on, a regular segment here on Press Watch. We call it Bravos and Blunders, where we take a look at some of the most recent stories from the campaign trail that represent journalism at its best and sometimes at its worst. To get the show started, though, I'd like to introduce our expert guests joining us today. First, the president of Oklahoma City University and former chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, Robert Henry, as well as Michael McNutt, reporter for the Capitol with the Oklahoman and veteran newsman, well over 3 decades at this point. You've been doing this for a long time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Happy to be here, but he's the real expert.
You and I, well, President Henry, you and I talk a lot about the Fourth Estate, so we're getting ready to go there because we want to jump right in and talk about social media, first thing. And the first thing that I want to start us off by showing to you is a clip from CNN. CNN was doing kind of one of their coffee shop style, the correspondent talks to the analysts. And there was an analyst, Tim Miller, he's from the Republican National Committee, and he was referring to David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, and something that Brooks wrote recently. There was an op-ed piece, it was supposed to be a parody, it was humorous, about Mitt Romney, and they're getting his reaction, and he makes a comment that I really want to get your response to. So if we can go ahead and take a look at that clip really quickly here.
What is true is that nobody cares what the old bulls think anymore. And David Brooks,
but it's
who
still
was
it's
like,
the most emailed
right,
story on the site.
But he was a central part of the conversation in like 2004 and 2008. But David Brooks isn't part of the conversation anymore. I mean, the real conversation that operatives have on Twitter, and Brooks isn't on Twitter. And
you know, and what he said about, he called him an old bull, and the real operatives, he said, have conversations on Twitter. Brooks isn't even on Twitter. Almost a dismissive comment. And so, Mr. McNutt, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind, and just ask you your opinion. Twitter, social media, so important, but what does this comment, this sort of comment, say to you about the role of social media for journalists?
Well, you know, everyone has their opinion, of course, but social media is a certain aid to us, and Twitter is important for us to get our stories out, reaches a new audience, a younger audience usually. But anyone can Twitter, and I think that's why consumers have to be, and readers have to be careful. Who are these people who are on Twitter? And our concern in newspapers essentially is that it's awfully hard to get a complex issue such as a political candidate race campaign in 140-word segments. And I think credibility is very important, and we use it obviously again to highlight our stories,
right, and
try to get people to realize, hey, we're writing about this issue's coming up, and it's good to get comments from our readers, and Twitter's a way for them, and Facebook is a way for our readers to communicate directly with a reporter. But I don't know if social media really is ever intended to be a news source entirely exclusively. It's a good conversation piece, and certainly it generates news and gets more people involved in that process, but I don't think it's ever intended to be just a sole source of news. And to discount established reporters with a newspaper, magazine, network television, probably is a mistake for some people.
And obviously, this is rhetoric. That's part of his job. He needs to try and dismiss things that are negative. But President Henry, you and I, like I said, we talk about the Fourth Estate a lot, and so I think, as you said, that it is meant to be a source of conversation. It's not supposed to be. I don't think clearly 140 characters is not a story. So, President Henry, what are your thoughts as far as the gatekeeping service that journalists are supposed to be providing in terms of disseminating information? Clearly, we can't do that in 140 characters. So what are your thoughts here?
Well, I just have to be frank. I was very disappointed in that comment. Now, admit my biases. At my investiture as president here, we brought David Brooks in to be our speaker, and hundreds of people crowded Freedy Center to come hear him. He's a commentator on several news networks, a distinguished writer, best-selling author. My guess is what he has to say is kind of important.
Of course.
And he is a journalist. It's disappointing that someone would try to, because he made some criticism toward the ticket, someone would shoot the messenger. You know, Brooks, as I recall, is a Republican. I don't know. I would suppose he probably leans to Romney. But as Michael was saying, the problem with a lot of this social media is there are no principles of journalism involved. There are people that are just writing stuff, and the sources aren't checked. If you write a story with your byline in the Oklahoman, you're going to check it. You're not going to put stuff out there. You may quote someone, but you're not going to say something has happened without checking it. And I think it's dangerous for people to think, it's absurd to think that a tweet can cover the complexity needed to decide who to vote for in a presidential election. And it's dangerous to rely on social media that has no principles and ethics of journalism involved in it.
Well, and I think you made a really good point here about the principles of journalism, and I think that it's worthy of noting how we use social media. I think there's definitely a distinction between reporters using Twitter, for example, to put headlines out there. And there's a definite difference between that and then taking tweets that we get back from the public and using that as an element of our story. And I just want to show you there's a couple of different ways that, at least in terms of the RNC, that social media is being used. I want to see, we have from NBC, we have a picture, I think, of their multimedia coverage where they've done an actual, just the social media is its own story. This is from NBC Politics. And just discussing social media, they have a whole series of pictures that they've taken from random sources, and they've made the social media from other people its own story, its own component of their political coverage. And that's one thing that we do use regularly. But I think that going back to what you were saying, President Henry, as far as, I think if we separate what social media is happening as its own story, if we label it social media and we say, look, this is what other people are saying on Facebook, this is not what we, the journalists, are saying on Facebook. In your opinion, is that still valid, or are there still concerns in that if we're covering social media as its own story? How do you feel about that, President Henry?
I was actually thinking as Michael was talking that I really hadn't thought about how it could be useful to you in preparing a story, and I can clearly see that it would be. And I also enjoy these things you see when they let people indicate how they're reacting to a speech as it's going, and so you can see the EKG of the speech going on, and somebody says, "My mother from Donegal, Ireland," and all of a sudden everything goes up, and people are clutching their heart. Those things are useful. There are 3 times as many reporters as there are delegates to the Republican National Convention there. So there are a lot of people doing a lot of social media. I think it's interesting, but again, I want to see, if I'm going to make up my mind, I want to see something that a journalist like David Brooks or Michael has written.
Right, and definitely different quality of commentary when it's coming from the journalist as opposed to from random people. And that's what I want to show you. Another example of how Twitter actually has been used in the Republican National Convention. Let's just listen to sound for just a minute. This is from Scott Walker when he was speaking, governor of Wisconsin. Let's take a look at this from ABC real quickly.
Men and women of courage who think more about the future of their children and their grandchildren than they did about their own political careers.
Okay, and this is the sort of thing that we've seen really commonly, which are running across the bottom live tweets, if you will, of people, just random people that are saying, yay, Scott Walker, yay, whatever. So let me ask you, Michael, as far as using just comments from the general public, do you feel like, I mean, how useful is that? How much are we getting out of that? Do you feel like that's relevant in terms of coverage to put up for our, our viewers what just their peers are saying?
Well, I think it's interesting, like President Henry was saying, it's good to see during a speech, for instance, like we were watching there, you can see the ebbs and flows. If, CNN used to have, 4 years ago, used to have an audience meter. They used to have an audience panel.
See the graphic.
And they had people basically wiring in, did they like it or not, and it was just a graph. This is a little easier to read, and you're seeing what people think, and usually it's kind of fascinating because you want to say, well, I like what that person had to say, and then maybe on Twitter they're saying, I like it, or the person may say, that's silly. I think with the Clint Eastwood speech we heard at the convention, that would have been interesting to see what people were thinking, maybe a bunch of question marks. But we use that on the Oklahoman as a website, News OK, and during Representative Ryan's speech, one of our reporters gathered a lot of what was being said on Twitter, and she went through a number of political consultants and delegates' Twitter accounts and was trying to gather from them, what are they saying? Was he hitting a nerve? And that's who he's trying to reach. Right. And compile that into a story. I think it's interesting. I think it's maybe an ethical concern. Who's deciding which tweets go on the screen? I mean, we like to think that they're just they're grabbing them as they appear on their computer screen and just putting them on. If you're doing that, then that's fine. But there's always a possibility.
Do you think that's fine if they're just grabbing as they're coming? Because that makes me wonder about what President Henry was saying about the editing process. I think that probably practically speaking, just putting live things up as they come in, that could be kind of dangerous. But
well, it seems, I think you're getting a more spontaneous response than waiting. What you're doing the same thing, going out in the street after the speech. What did you think? Instead of that, everybody wants. It seems to me everybody wants things quicker and faster, and so now you're getting it simultaneously. The concern, of course, is what are you putting up there? You better have a censor to make sure you're not putting any libelous or wrong words up there. So someone needs to be screening that, and I think someone needs to make sure that you're not just getting one side of the opinion. And the concern, of course, is hey, if I'm a candidate, what do you think I'm going to tell my supporters? Get on Facebook or Twitter and just flood that thing with how great I'm doing.
Right, tell me.
Right, and so I think what you'll end up doing, I think it's good now, it's kind of a novelty, but you have to be concerned that campaigns would basically going against each other. Maybe they would drown out what the average person is thinking because they're having their volunteers. And what do you think?
Well, no, I agree with you that there needs to be some neutral way. You don't need somebody picking them out and saying, I'm going to put all these up. As they come in randomly is fair, or some sort of sampling. You're probably not going to get that. Random is probably the best, fairest way you can do it.
Randomly might be ethically best, but maybe not practically the easiest way to do that.
But I liked your thought about if we'd had these when the mystery guest was speaking. My guess is most of them would have been, didn't that guy used to be Clint Eastwood?
I thought it was Dirty Harry. What happened?
Yeah.
Who is the invisible man that he's talking to? Okay, I just want to show you one more example of another similar way, also from ABC. I'm not picking on ABC by any means. They just used Twitter in a couple of different ways. This is opposed to being tweets from random folks coming in across the bottom. Let's take a look at this real quick, and I'll show you what I mean.
My grandfather, like millions of other immigrants, didn't come here for some government guarantee of income equality or government benefits to take care of his family. In 1923, there were no government.
Okay, and so I pointed this clip out because the reason that it was graphically, I think, graphically separate is because the ones running across the bottom of the screen were live tweets that were coming in from random folks. These, you could tell, were pre-planned by producers, things that had been said within the last couple of days that were coming up for the Santorum speech. And so they had these kind of in advance that you could read what other people had said at the same time. That's a different editing process. That's planning in advance, choosing what goes with what's going to come in the speech. And I'm going to throw this out to both of you. In my mind, that's more of the traditional kind of gatekeeping and decision-making process in terms of it's kind of the same almost as picking out a soundbite, if you will, from what people say in advance and then using that and incorporating it in your story. That's what I think it's similar to. What about the two of you?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to that, just another background informational highlight, and just to give some the viewers some more information, maybe some more background. For instance, like that we just saw that Santorum released his delegates, because some people, he hadn't released them until a week before the convention, so some were wondering what's going to happen. Big concern was that Ron Paul group, they were trying to broker the convention if he. So there was some concern that some thought that Santorum and Gingrich would keep their delegates so that they could not release their delegates to Ron Paul. They waited at the last minute, of course. But I think that's another example of social media. I don't want to take away from the president, but Ron Paul group and a third-party group can use that social media to really motivate and get people involved in a campaign. And one thing we saw with the Ron Paul group, they were really motivated. And they challenged the state conventions, and they came out in great numbers. And a lot of that was done through social media.
They took a page from President Obama's playbook. I mean, he's the guy who really started social media, using it effectively 4 years ago. Yes. But I was just thinking, again, as you were talking, you made me think of something new, which is good. You and I are old guys. What do they call David Brooks?
An old bull.
Well, we're old bulls.
An old bull.
But I can remember when you didn't know what was going to happen at a political convention, when everything wasn't scripted. I can even remember when there weren't teleprompters. And there was a certain excitement about it. I mean, you kind of wonder what this person's going to say. Everything is so tightly scripted now. There were two unscripted things. Condoleezza Rice, who was great, and Clint Eastwood, who I think was a distraction to the message. But at least providing some of those tweets give us something that isn't scripted. So maybe that's a positive contribution of social media.
And it is unfortunate the conventions have become so scripted. One of the reasons probably is network television coverage. Everything is based on time. They want to see in advance how much time right now we're seeing just the 2 hours at nights, but they didn't want those long drawn out conventions that we saw in the 50s and 40s and maybe as late as the 60s. They wanted to say, okay, when are you going to have your nominee make his acceptance speech? And they didn't want to have unknown commodities because they want to have the cameras in place. They didn't want, so it's become more like a scripted, just like we're seeing with sports and everything else, where television has had much more influence. And of course, the political parties need television, network television, to cover them because that gets their message out to the masses. Cable television is great, but it doesn't have, not everybody has cable. And just an aside, if you can have C-SPAN, that was probably the best way to watch the convention. Unedited, no commentators, and you saw what was going on in between the speakers, and some great footage of the delegates and things of that nature, but you actually were seeing a convention basically unedited. And without, we saw a lot of concern, just some of the networks turned away, did not show all the speeches, did not show some of the speakers, and some people, depending what party affiliation, were saying that was deliberate. They didn't want to show minority members and Republicans, and so that's the danger, I think, when you don't show the entire convention, or at least show it live when you're going to show it. When you break away for interviews or commentating, people will wonder, why aren't you showing that's part of the speech or who that speaker is?
Everybody's trying to avoid the 1964 Democratic Convention, which was the most disastrous convention probably in the history of conventions. And now things are so terribly scripted, and it's
different.
It's mildly disappointing. And I find this morning I was on my little exercise bike and watching Joe, what's his name? The breakfast.
Joe?
Morning Joe.
Morning Joe, and I kind of enjoyed that because you did get some spontaneous give and take.
And you get some analysis
Right.
in there too. All right.
The Democrats are going to go with a 3-day convention instead of a 4-day. And I was reading a comment from a Republican consultant on CNN who was saying if you can cut it down to 3 days, you can cut it down to 2 days. If you can cut it down to 2 days, you can cut it down to 1. And if you cut it down to 1, maybe you don't need a convention. Do you think conventions are outdated?
No, I would say that, you know, Will Rogers famously said a Democrat would rather make a speech than a dollar. So I think cutting off another day is going to be hard. But I still feel like there is some benefit. It is a public place, and we do sort of come together as a nation to watch this, and we talk about it. So I wish it were more genuine and real, but I still think it serves a purpose.
Whether we're using social media or not, absolutely it serves a purpose. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt you. We're having a great conversation, but we do need to take a very quick break. President Henry, I know you have another commitment. I just want to thank you so much for taking your time to be here with us today. We always appreciate your input.
I'm pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to share the dais with Michael.
Absolutely, we are as well. And so, Michael, if I can ask you to hang out with us for just a few more minutes. All right, coming up next on Press Watch, margin of error. Are we giving viewers enough information about polling data? What constitutes fine print that's too fine? We'll have more with Michael McNutt when we come back. Stay around. Welcome back to Press Watch 2012, where we're looking at behavior of the national news media in terms of ethical journalism. This is all throughout the course of this presidential election. Today specifically, we've been talking about coverage of the Republican National Convention with senior reporter Michael McNutt from the Oklahoman. Once again, we're so grateful that you joined us. Thanks for sticking around. Kind of a nice segue, I think, from what we were just talking about, which was social media. We want to talk a little bit about polling data and margin of error. And this isn't exactly polling data, but I want to show you something interesting that came from ABC News as a partnership with Yahoo News. It was a Twitter-related story. So let's go ahead and watch that clip real quickly.
Twitter is not always the most positive place. A lot of people get on there to complain, to express discontent, but the sentiment surrounding Ann Romney is some of the most positive we've seen around any politician. So 68% of the tweets around Ann Romney are positive.
So like we were talking about before, Twitter is its own story. But what I thought was interesting there, it was hard to see, it was at the very bottom of the screen. It said, from a sample size of tweets. And it doesn't say anything to help us regular non-statistician folks understand a large sample size, a random sample size. What does that mean? And my question to you is, in terms of giving our viewers information about the data that we're gathering, do we need that much information? Is that part of our job?
Well, I believe so. Our policy at the Oklahoman, when we run polling, we run very few polling stories, but when we do, it's very important that we cite two things. Of course, three things. Who did the polling, the margin of error, and then the sampling size. Because that helps our readers gauge how credible this is. You know, polling is just a snapshot of people's opinions at that particular point in time. It's already outdated as soon as the poll's been conducted, because people could change their minds seconds later.
True.
But we also, I think, important, we want to know what the margin of error is. So if you have a close race, let's say if two candidates in a race, and one candidate A's got 52%, the other's got 48, that's a pretty close margin. But if you have margin of error 8%, that poll is not as essential if that polling margin of error was 2%. So, and then also you want to know your sampling size. Just how many people did you talk to? And did you talk to registered voters? If you don't talk to registered voters, you're talking to people who are irrelevant.
And that was the first thing I was thinking of with this. From a sample size of tweets, I thought, great. From a sample size of 8 tweets that you went
What
through.
What is the sample size? Is
Right,
it the giant size, deluxe size, whatever? Well, how many people participated in that particular sampling?
And this was just a Twitter-related story, but we have some pictures. We just kind of grabbed some random, this is not representative of everything every network has done, but I want to show you what something from CBS looked like in one of their polls, not Twitter, this was an actual poll. And they gave a margin of error down here, but again, margin of error 3 points. So at least it's up there. That's really kind of teeny tiny though. So again, I go back to the whole, how much information do we need? At this point in the election, this far away from November, how significant is this? I mean, it's close here, so I feel like maybe that 3 point is significant, but do we need more of I mean, what are you thinking here?
Well, I think we're fascinated by polls. And I think a lot of it is our society, American society. You look at some of the more popular TV shows. You got your Dancing with the Stars, you got your American Idol, and they're all dictated by what? Polls. Who's ahead?
What other people think.
What other people think. And so I think now, partially, we want to see in our presidential and our campaign life, well, who's ahead right now? And even though it's, just now kicking off, really Labor Day weekends kind of traditionally starts the campaign season for the November elections, we've seen polling going on for quite some time. And I think people just want to know who's ahead. Why? Maybe they want to be more associated with the winner. Maybe they like the idea if they support President Obama, they think, hey, majority of the country supports him. I feel like I'm with the winning crowd.
Right, right.
Or if you're, Governor Romney, you may feel like, well, we're close. We're not way behind. We're within striking distance. And I think we're just curious, where we stand, who's ahead. We want to know instantly who's ahead, like Major League Baseball standings. You don't want to go the whole season, 162 games, without having
not
the
knowing
standings.
where somebody is, right.
Because you want to know where they are.
Right, right.
And this, of course, isn't as concrete as baseball standings. Those are actually determined by the actual result of a game. This is questioning people. Then I think the other question that we talked about, who are these people? Somewhere shouldn't there be registered voters of how many registered voters were they across the country? Maybe they just picked some states that might be more favorable for a Republican or for a Democrat.
And speaking specifically to that too, let me show you 2 more pictures really quickly, because NBC, just one from a story in Andrea Mitchell's show. This one, we've got the margin of error down here that's so small, I'm not even sure that it's useful, because you really can't, even when I was watching it on big TV at home, I couldn't even make it out at home. The next one I find really fascinating though is from ABC, and ABC, what they've done here is they say sampling error information is at abcnews.com. So they're telling us where the poll comes from. It's from the Washington Post. That I think is a good thing. What I find interesting is that ABC makes you go to their website, and I went to their website. I looked at this, and you have to guess where this story might be. You have to sort through the stories and find it. Then to get this information, you have to download a PDF and scroll through about 12 pages before you can figure out who they surveyed, what the margin of error was. I'm willing to bet that most folks probably aren't going to do that.
Probably not.
So in your opinion?
Well, again, I think that it's important, these polls, I think it gives a snapshot of what people are thinking at a particular time. But I think we also owe it to our readers and viewers to let them know what that margin of error is, the size of that sampling data, and ideally where that polling took place. Is it just the eastern part of the country? Is it nationwide? Is it just Florida? Where did this polling take place? And that in turn will give you an idea, because if it's a Republican-dominated area, then you say, well, Romney's ahead, but not by much. If it's a Democratic area, then you think the president may need to get to work. If it's nationwide, you think, well, that's pretty split wide open, might be open. But I think you need that margin. I think there's a danger for media outlets not to get that information, because if you don't give it, people will get used to just seeing those numbers and not asking.
And not processing where they come from.
Right now, I think most people are used to saying, what's the margin of error? How many people are... But if you keep using these polls and not giving that information or making it harder to find that information, people will stop asking that question. And next thing you know, they're reciting these poll numbers, but what do they mean?
Right. How useful are they actually? And RTDNA, one of the things we talk about a lot on the show are the spirit of ethical guidelines that we get from the Society of Professional Journalists and also the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. And one of RTDNA's codes specifically says, you know, that we need to disclose the origin of information and label all material that comes from outsiders. And I think you and I are on the same page here. That is it labeled? Yes. Does it follow the spirit of those ethical guidelines?
Right, and our role as journalists is to give accurate information to our readers or viewers, our listeners, and if we don't provide the information where we get that information, oftentimes we have, in addition to our stories, we may contain a box or graphic, and to give more information to our readers. And at the bottom of that,
so if you want it, you can get to it.
Right, and at the bottom of that, we have where we got that information, a source, so that people will know it's just not made up. Where do we get it from? Are these figures from the state office, of the national office? Is it from some group? Or is it just, we don't have anything there? I think our readers are demanding to know, where do you get this information?
Right.
And I think we have to keep putting that information out there so that our readers expect it. Because once they don't see that side of information, then they're repeating information which may not be accurate, and then they're telling other people, and before you know it, they're making...
And we haven't done our due diligence.
Right, and they're making poor decisions, perhaps.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. We are going to take one more quick break. We're going to ask you to stick around one more time for us. Coming up next on Press Watch, a regular segment that we do here in every show. It's called Bravos and Blunders. This week, we have one of both, actually. But the big blunder that everybody is talking about that happened during the RNC coverage, the national news correspondent who was fired for something he said when he didn't know his microphone was turned on. We'll have more with Michael McNutt on that coming up in just a moment. Welcome back to Press Watch 2012. We're still talking about national news coverage of the Republican National Convention in Tampa recently. It's time now for Press Watch's Bravos and Blunders. It's a couple of examples of the best and worst that we've seen in journalism. We'll bounce those off of Michael McNutt from the Oklahoman, who's been kind enough to stick around with us yet again.
I'm not in the blunder, am I?
No, of course not. Absolutely not.
Sure.
We wouldn't have you sitting here, I think. No, I'm just kidding. So our blunder first, we're going to start there. Very recently, a lot of people are talking about this. Yahoo News, Washington Bureau Chief David Chalian made a mistake. He wasn't on camera, so this clip that we have, it's a little hard to hear, so we put what he's saying. He's kind of talking in the background. Obviously didn't realize that his microphone is still open. So let's take a look at it really quickly, and then we'll talk about it.
They are happy to have a party with black people drowning.
Okay, so he's making a comment while another news anchor is talking about this video of the Romneys, and he's talking to someone else in the background, and this is what he says. Yahoo immediately let him go. Chalian issued an apology saying that he was making a joke, talking to people, you know, other journalists. I think, you know, journalists are human beings, and we make jokes, we make inappropriate jokes. Lots of people do. That doesn't make it okay. That makes us fallible human beings. What I think is interesting is that there has been mixed response from the journalism community. Gwen Ifill from PBS tweeted immediately after defending him. Sam Donaldson also has defended him. Other journalists on the rampage saying it was inexcusable. And I just kind of want to ask you for your thoughts.
Well, I think it just shows the danger of broadcast media. When you have an open mic, you always assume it's open. We have that transition of newspapers. You know, we have a website, and also we do video interviews, and some are live. We have live chats. And as reporters segue into that electronic digital media, the one thing, the cautionary moment, is always be careful, be thinking what you're saying, because exactly what you're saying, any job, I mean, if you go into any kind of office, people are human, they're going to crack jokes, they're going to have even as horrible Hurricane Isaac was, some people might crack a joke about, you know,
sure,
churning up the Gulf or something of that nature. Doesn't intend to, but when you put it on a live or associated with a news program, it takes on a different meaning, and it certainly can be insulting to people, and people don't see the humor in it, obviously. So we just have to be very careful. What kind of punishment should be, discipline should be handed out is each individual news organization's decision, and I don't know what their policies were. They may have a specific black and white policy. You will be terminated if an off-color remark or an unsavory comment gets broadcast. So I think it depends on each organization's, but it's something that people have to take very seriously. But
absolutely.
Familiarity, though, causes sometimes we get forgetful,
complacent,
and complacent, and it's a story that's not that unusual, is it? I mean, there's a number of broadcasters who have
the great perils of live TV, as you said.
And so I guess the best thing is just always assume that every mic is on, and it just shows that you know, anything you say in a flippant manner, it has a whole different life of its own, seen differently than just the person you were talking to.
Absolutely. Okay, our Bravo for today is from actually a Time magazine article, is the one that gave Wolf Blitzer from CNN. Time magazine gave him, in a web article, a thumbs up for he was having a discussion with Rand Paul, of course, Rand Paul's son, and Rand Paul started going through a little bit of political rhetoric, and Wolf stopped him and caught him on it. Let's watch that real quickly.
I support them because I think they're way better, no question. I don't know that our country really survives 4 more years of all the regulations that we're getting and the debt.
That's a little harsh.
Oh, it is.
Survives?
It is. Yes. I mean,
wait a second. If President Obama is reelected, you think the United States of America in 4 years will not be the United States of America?
I'm worried about our currency, not just because of this president from 40 years of deficit spending, but it's accelerating.
All right, so Time magazine said, yay, Wolf Blitzer, for stopping him and asking him to clarify what is clearly a little bit of political rhetoric. So I'm a little bit torn. Is that a bravo, or is that a yay for meeting the bar situation? I feel like that's something we should be doing, not to take anything away from Wolf, but is that what we should be doing anyway?
Well, we should, but unfortunately, it does, you know, sometimes reporters, and we talked about, you know, reporters doing many things now. There's tasking. You know, many are tweeting at meetings while they're covering the meeting. Wolf, while he's interviewing Rand Paul, is probably having a director telling him,
producer talking in his ear, right?
You know, how much time he's left or where to look, and so to pay attention to that, to his source, is commendable. And not to let that...
It's harder than it looks.
It's harder than it looks. And the other thing is, candidates today, they realize that whether it's a local race or a national race, they want to get their message out. And they're used to these, they're being told, you've got to get your message out, do it in 140 words on your Twitter, but also if you're being interviewed, get it out whatever way you can so that you get it out and you control, and the more you're speaking, the less a question that you're going to be asked that you may not know the answer to. So it's harder. I think seasoned reporters like Wolf will be more at ease to say, wait a minute, and back up, what are you trying to say? Or stop a candidate from just rambling along their campaign message, which you've heard on commercial upon commercial. It's tougher, I think, for younger reporters because, especially if it's a national candidate, is giving their, you think, well, it's impolite. You know, I shouldn't interrupt. You know, your parents told you not to interrupt, but we're reporters. We're supposed to interrupt to get the message out clearly.
Polite is not always the point.
Right, so that we understand it, so we can give our readers, our viewers, a better understanding of what is being said. And if someone gets a little bit hyperbole, we should kind of make sure that that's what they're trying to say, or to keep them on point. So, yeah, they probably shouldn't get a bravo, but he gets a pat on the back for doing his job. I think that's good. All right.
There you go, pat on the back. All right, thank you so much. We're out of time, but Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your insight.
Enjoyed being here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's about all the time we have for Press Watch 2012 today. We are, of course, grateful to both of our distinguished guests. Press Watch is a production of Oklahoma City University in partnership with the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. On the next edition of Press Watch, new coverage from the Democratic National Convention. So join us next time.